As dawn broke over Doha, it wasn't just the Qatari sun that burned with intensity. The eyes of the world were fixed on a high-stakes meeting that could recalibrate the future of the Persian Gulf and beyond. In the span of just 3 days, American and Iranian negotiators converged on the neutral ground of Qatar's capital faces, grim but resolute, determined to wrestle with a series of issues that have lingered over the region like an approaching storm. For decades, tensions in the Straits of Hormuz have acted as the world's pressure valve. Every time the temperature rises, the ripple effect is felt on every continent at every level of the global economy. It was never going to be just a matter of diplomatic niceties and polite press conferences. These talks, after months of drone strikes, tit-for-tat naval maneuvers, cyber skirmishes, and public threats, represented not merely another round of old rivals crossing swords, but a rare recognition from both sides that the margin for miscalculation had all but vanished. The specter of a blockade, or worse, a direct confrontation, had sent energy markets into spasms and left insurance rates for shipments through Hormuz at record highs. Inside the conference halls, interpreters worked feverishly, diplomats weighed each word, and intelligence operatives scoured every gesture for signs of sincerity or subterfuge. The stakes were unmistakable. More than 20% of the world's traded oil flows through this waterway, and a single misstep could trigger a cascade of consequences: fuel shortages, price shocks, and a rapid spiral into regional chaos. It's no wonder that as delegations emerged under the relentless camera flashes, markets from Tokyo to New York held their breath. The stakes weren't just regional, but truly global, and everyone wanted to know, would Doha mark the dawn of stability or the start of a new set of risks? Within hours of the final handshake in Doha, both Washington and Tehran eagerly broadcast their narrative to the world dialogue. Not destruction had prevailed. U.S. officials lauded the talks as a return to responsible engagement, emphasizing scenes of negotiators seated across tables rather than warships squaring off in the Gulf. American news outlets ran with headlines proclaiming a diplomatic breakthrough featuring sound bites about mutual understanding and the de-escalation of tensions. Presidential spokespeople framed the outcome as proof that American leadership, patience, and alliances still matter on the world stage. Iranian state media marched in lockstep. The headlines spoke of diplomatic victory and a reaffirmation of Iranian sovereignty in the Persian Gulf. Commentators repeated slogans about strength through dialogue, depicting Iran as both principled and unbowed, a nation capable of standing up to maximum Western pressure and still choosing peace for the benefit of the region. Government officials pointedly highlighted that Iran's core demands had been acknowledged, at least for continued talks. Across the board, the message was clear. Both sides wanted their publics and allies to believe the worst had been averted, that negotiation works, and that leaders had chosen wisdom over war. Yet as reporters celebrated the apparent detente, seasoned observers couldn't help but wonder, was this genuine progress or the familiar packaging of a fragile pause as triumph? What transpired behind the diplomatic formality and strategic smiles in Doha was a negotiation far more raw and consequential than the official soundbites reveal. At the heart of the talks lay a clash over the true gatekeeper of the Strait of Hormuz, who would determine the movement of the tankers and warships, and who would have the final say when tensions flared. The Iranian delegation pressed relentlessly for guarantees that regional shipping, especially its own oil exports, would not be hindered by U.S. naval maneuvers, intelligence surveillance, or last-minute regulatory hurdles imposed under the veneer of security. In return, the Americans demanded robust mechanisms for rapid notification of all Iranian military activity near the waterway, a transparent communication protocol designed to reduce the risk of accidental skirmishes. The U.S. also insisted on keeping its Fifth Fleet's presence in the Gulf, framing it both as a deterrent to aggression and a stability guarantee for allies. On the table, as always, were the unwieldy stacks of economic sanctions that have throttled Iran's access to global finance. Iranian negotiators wanted a clear path to sanctions relief, using access to Hormuz as a key bargaining chip, loosen the siege and the world's oil supply remain safe, tighten it, and Tehran's asymmetric options remain unspoken but ominous. Energy leverage hovered like a shadow over every clause. Both sides warily eyed global oil prices, understanding that the power to spike or soothe markets grants a silent diplomatic weapon. For the U.S., uninterrupted flow is a strategic imperative beyond mere economics. For Iran, it's existential. Thus, while the official record will show talk of confidence-building measures, the undertone was clear. Each side sought binding assurances without surrendering an ounce of leverage, fully aware that one false promise could shatter trust with global implications. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a narrow ribbon of water separating the Arabian Peninsula from Iran. It is in many ways the beating heart of the world's energy supply chain. Every single day tankers transporting more than a fifth of all globally traded oil must thread this constricted passage, often less than 30 miles wide at its narrowest point. The sea lanes here carry not only oil, but also the lifeblood of modern economies, petrochemicals, liquefied natural gas, and critical raw materials destined for factories and power plants from Tokyo to Rotterdam. For regional players, the symbolism is potent. Iran sees Hormuz as both a shield and a sword, a natural barrier against foreign intervention, and a powerful lever over adversaries. The ability to threaten closure even indirectly grants Tehran political weight far in excess of its conventional military reach. Not surprisingly, Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE see the Strait's stability as synonymous with their own economic survival. To them, any sign of Iranian overreach threatens both national revenue and domestic stability, fueling their investment in naval assets, missile defense, and foreign partnerships. On the world stage, major powers watch Hormuz with a wary eye. For the United States and its allies, maintaining freedom of navigation here validates the projection of power and the integrity of global trading systems. The mere perception of risk in Hormuz can roil energy markets, sending prices soaring and sparking strategic anxieties, even in countries far removed from the Gulf. Russian and Chinese strategists, meanwhile, view the Strait as a fulcrum to tilt influence and test America's resolve. Symbolically, Hormuz is a crossroads of commerce confrontation and negotiation, a place where every ripple can become a wave, transforming local incidents into global crises. It's not just geography, it's the world's most precarious artery, and everyone with a stake in stability knows what rides on its security. To understand what truly drove Washington and Tehran back to the table in Doha, we need to trace a timeline marked by steadily mounting tension, calculated shows of force, and a series of near misses that threatened to ignite a much wider conflict. The spiral began months earlier with a string of maritime confrontations, suspicious sabotage of oil tankers, attempted seizures, and dueling accusations of drone incursions into sovereign airspace. Each incident was followed by harsh condemnations, and at times thinly veiled threats of military reprisal. As rhetoric escalated, so did on-the-ground risks. The United States escalated its military posture, dispatching additional warships and surveillance aircraft to the Gulf. The Fifth Fleet conducted high-visibility patrols through Hormuz, while Iran showcased its own naval war games and tested new anti-ship capabilities. Sabotage attacks on an oil pipeline in the UAE and a missile strike against a Saudi refinery jolted global markets, sending shockwaves through boardrooms and ministerial offices alike. Even minor incidents, a mistaken warning shot, a crippled vessel requiring rescue became flashpoints for propaganda and saber-rattling. Diplomatic back channels kept barely alive through Oman and Switzerland struggled to keep dialogue open as both sides braced for escalation. The rhetoric peaked after a particularly dangerous episode when an Iranian missile narrowly missed a U.S. destroyer, prompting Washington to issue an explicit warning of consequences for any further provocation. The cycle of threat and retaliation proved unsustainable as energy prices surged and insurance rates for shipping soared. Regional allies from Abu Dhabi to Ankara began to quietly urge both powers to step back from the brink. It was against this backdrop, when the costs of continued brinkmanship were outpacing any tactical gains, that the call went out for real talks in Doha. The timing was no accident. It was a forced return to the negotiation table, born of necessity, exhaustion, and a mutual recognition of just how close the region had come to disaster. While the official communiques touted compromise and restraint, the subtext whispered something else entirely. The language coming out of Washington and Tehran was carefully measured, but the careful listener could detect signals meant less for international audiences and more for hardliners and skeptics at home. American officials, for instance, celebrated progress on maritime security, yet left out any specifics about actual constraints on U.S. naval maneuvers, preserving ambiguity about whether any real concessions had been made. When press spokespeople deftly pivoted to platitudes about deterrence and partnership, never committing to new limits that might anger hawks in Congress or allied capitals. Iran's statements, meanwhile, oscillated between triumph and warning. While foreign ministry officials extolled the acknowledgement of Iranian interests, Revolutionary Guard leaders issued not-so-veiled reminders that all options remain on the table should provocations persist. State media pushed the narrative of a diplomatic win while quietly running pieces about readiness for all scenarios. Neither side shared key discussion points with the press, such as whether hormonal protocols for incident notification were actually agreed, or if future sanctions relief timelines had even been structurally discussed. At the same time, insiders leaked rumors of secret side agreements, fueling speculation online and among regional observers who know that what's not written into a treaty often matters far more than what is. This mix of triumphant rhetoric and omissive silence is hardly coincidence. Both leaderships must reassure global markets and their own power bases all while keeping their hands free for the next unpredictable chapter. For analysts and for any viewer who refuses to settle for headlines, the real drama is often in what's left unsaid in the fertile space between official words and battlefield realities where hidden agendas quietly drive the next moves. Though headlines fixate on the direct dialogue between Washington and Tehran, the true shape of Hormuz diplomacy emerges only when we zoom out to the wider cast of regional and global actors jockeying for advantage. For Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the Strait is an ongoing obsession. Without guaranteed maritime security, their economies and social contracts are at grave risk. Both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have invested billions in naval modernization and advanced air defense, not only to deter Iran, but also to reassure international investors that Gulf oil will keep flowing even in a crisis. With every flare-up, Gulf capitals rethink alliance strategies, quietly assessing the reliability of U.S. military backing, flirting with tighter regional defense pacts, and even considering covert dialogues with adversaries to hedge their bets. Israel, ever the regional hawk, monitors every negotiation for signs of Iranian maneuvering. For Tel Aviv, concessions over Hormuz risk emboldening Iran's missile and proxy strategy from Lebanon to Yemen. Israeli officials use diplomatic leverage in Washington and European capitals to ensure that any agreement doesn't translate into new freedoms for Iran elsewhere in the region. In return, Israel signals sometimes through subtle intelligence leaks just how close it is willing to push back, heightening the risk calculus for all. China and Russia play the long game. Beijing is now the world's largest oil importer, and its Belt and Road ambitions would be devastated by any prolonged strait disruption. Thus, Chinese diplomats press for calm, quietly expand naval capabilities, and strike deals for long-term crude purchases regardless of Western sanctions. Russia, by contrast, profits from tension. Every premium on Gulf oil is a bonus for Siberian barrels, and every spat that ties down. U.S. attention creates opportunities for Moscow from Syria to Central Asia. Europe, though, split by energy needs and diplomatic caution, fears above all instability that could spark a refugee or energy crisis. In Hormuz, every player's interests overlap and tangle, ensuring that one narrow waterway exerts multiplanetary gravity on global affairs. Beneath the press briefings and diplomatic photo ops, both the US and Iran walked away from Doha with new cards up their sleeves and a few lines they dare not let the other cross. For the US, the greatest leverage is its power to shape global energy flows. By keeping a tight grip on the security architecture in Hormuz, Washington can reassure allies and unsettle rivals, projecting deterrence without firing a shot. American dominance of naval routes remains its trump card, underscored by the visibility of carrier strike groups and the diplomatic muscle to rally international patrols. Iran, meanwhile, preserves its leverage through geography, missiles, and unpredictability. Despite sanctions and encirclement, Tehran retains the capacity to threaten closure of the strait or conduct asymmetric hits against Western and Gulf interests. Its partnership networks with proxy groups give it escalation options that are deniable yet destabilizing. Just the possibility of a sudden action mining sea lanes, shadowing tankers, or launching cyber attacks keeps adversaries on edge and global markets attentive to every hint of tension. But the specter of red lines haunts both sides. For the US, an overt Iranian attack on international shipping or credible moves toward weaponizing Hormuz would trigger a forceful response. For Iran, another round of crippling sanctions with no diplomatic exit or any explicit challenge to its sovereignty in Gulf waters risks unleashing the very escalation everyone in Doha tried to avoid. So long as these lines hold leverage may prevent war, but the lines themselves remain dangerously thin red and always shifting with circumstance. With the ink barely dry on the statements from Doha, a new phase of watchfulness begins, because the greatest danger after high-profile diplomacy is often the unexpected spark rather than the grand design. The very issues deferred in the talks now loom as triggers a disputed tanker's passage, ignites a confrontation, a misinterpreted radar lock leads to a missile launch, a messaging failure turns a familiar maneuver into a perceived act of aggression. In a theater as crowded as the Gulf, even routine military exercises or intelligence flights can create sudden escalation if protocols falter or nerves fray. Spoilers are not limited to frontline actors. Proxy groups, militias, or even disgruntled factions within Iran or US allied governments may see incentive in derailing rapprochement, striking American assets in Iraq, sabotaging pipelines, or launching cyber operations whose origins are difficult to trace but easy to blame. Each tit-for-tat incident risks setting off a larger conflagration simply because the trust built in formal talks rarely trickles down to every operative commander or restless youth with an RPG or hacking tool. Further local politics can work against stability. A terror attack, botched intelligence assessment, or sudden leadership crisis in any Gulf capital could demand a show of resolve that overrides diplomatic progress. After talks like Doha, the world must look not just for the big announcements, but for the subtle warnings, the sudden change in shipping patterns, the coded language in briefings, the spike in insurance premiums, signs that the surface calm may be giving way to another gathering storm. The outcome of the Doha talks sends waves that reach far past the Persian Gulf's shimmering waters. For oil markets, even the hint of stability lowers prices, firms up supply contracts, and allows refiners and shippers to plan with greater confidence. After months of volatility, insurance rates for tankers dropped modestly and energy traders breathed a cautious sigh of relief. But this calm is always provisional. If the talks falter, prices could skyrocket overnight, sparking inflation and sending shockwaves through economies from New Delhi to Berlin. Energy security is more than just a matter of barrels and tankers. It reflects faith in the system itself. When international waters threaten to become war zones, governments accelerate their hunt for alternative routes, pushing ambitious pipeline projects, expanding emergency reserves, and seeking out new suppliers. The mere perception that Hormuz could close even briefly reshapes supply chains for years. In places like Europe or East Asia, long-held assumptions about where and how oil flows must be reconsidered, breeding new dependencies and vulnerabilities. On the grand chessboard of global order, every Gulf crisis tests America's promise as a world policeman, and gives rivals a chance to challenge that role. China and Russia watch for openings to increase their influence, offering security assurances or economic deals as alternatives to Western guarantees. What happens at the Hormuz choke point echoes in security councils, corporate boardrooms, and election campaigns worldwide, a local drama, but with consequences that are never merely local. In the wake of high-stakes Doha diplomacy, it's easy to be lulled by hopeful press releases. But real stability will reveal itself in the details, not just the declarations. First, monitor the frequency and tone of official communications. Does the White House or Iranian Foreign Ministry ramp up direct statements, or do messages turn vague and coded again? Watch shipping data and maritime alerts. A genuine easing of tensions usually results in increased tanker traffic, fewer military advisories, and a noted drop in insurance rates. Pay close attention to regional military movements. If American strike groups quietly redeploy home, or if Iranian Revolutionary Guard vessels reduce their visible patrols, it may signal new confidence in the negotiating process. On the other hand, any sharp uptick in drills, missile tests, or emergency summits almost always hints at friction beneath the surface. Track international reactions, particularly from Gulf capitals, China, and European governments. Moves toward independent maritime coalitions or renewed calls for UN involvement can indicate wavering faith in US-Iran détente. Lastly, stay alert for reports of proxy skirmishes, cyber disruptions, or unexplained incidents near the Strait. History shows the real test of any agreement often comes from those poised to upset it. By reading between the headlines, anyone can become their own analyst and spot the next crisis before it breaks. As the final handshakes fade and delegations leave Doha, the world confronts a question it cannot ignore. Have we witnessed the start of a genuine diplomatic thaw, or merely another turn in an endless standoff? Every statement from Washington or Tehran is crafted to project strength, but real security rests on more than practiced words. It depends on mutual credibility, verifiable restraint, and the political will to keep dialogue alive, even when passions flare. The stakes extend far beyond two rival capitals. Energy security, global markets, and the stability of entire regions ride on how seriously leaders and their publics treat this fragile opening. Are the promises just placeholders, or are both sides willing to risk backlash at home for a peace that lasts beyond the next provocation? For every observer, the challenge is to look critically at not just what's said, but what's done to spot the cycles that repeat, and to call out political theater when it masks deeper dangers. In the comments below, weigh in. Do you believe Doha has altered the pattern, or is the world fated to keep holding its breath at every Gulf crisis? Your reflections and questions matter, because the answers will shape not just the next headline, but the world we inherit.